Hey everyone, it's Ben Hardy here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about how much dealerships pay for both new cars and used cars as well. You also hear used cars be known as pre-owned vehicles, and then new, brand spanking new, I don't know. But anyways, that'll be the first part of this video, is just talking about how much dealerships pay for those, and then we are going to be talking about vehicles that are exceptions to the rule. So I'll give kind of like a general rule for new cars and used cars, and then we'll kind of get into some exceptions. And with all that being said, let's just get right into it. In this first part, let's actually talk about used cars. Now, used cars are going to be a little bit all over the place just because the used car market is typically more aggressive than the new car market. And what you'll see more common than not with the used car market is just pricing all over the place, right? If you went into a new car dealership, you're going to see two vehicles, let's say, that are exactly the same color, same year, same everything. They'll be the same price. Whereas you could see two used cars that have the same mileage, same color, same year, same everything, and they might be a little bit different with pricing, and that's just because of the human factor, right? There's no two used cars that are alike, because were the cars driven the same? Did they have the same owner? Typically not, right? Everyone drives cars differently, everyone takes care of them differently, all this kind of stuff. And so again, there's really no two used cars that are alike, so it makes the market a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more volatile sometimes. And again, the biggest thing is it makes the pricing go all over the place. And where this pertains to the dealerships is there's really just two main types of dealerships with used cars. There is the new car dealerships typically, or just the bigger dealerships, and then there is the used car lots. Now, first off, with the bigger dealerships, or typically the new car dealerships, they usually spend more money into a used car than a used car lot. The reason they do this is because reviews are very important for their business, because they want to do a lot of volume, they want to sell a lot of cars, they've got to advertise online. If they have a negative online presence, aka they've got bad reviews, they're not going to be able to do that. And so they have to make sure that people that buy new cars from them have a good experience, and people that buy used cars from them have a good experience. And the biggest indicator of someone having a good experience with buying a used car is not having issues with that car. So typically these bigger dealerships and these new car lots will put a lot more money into the car from a reconditioning standpoint. And what reconditioning is when they buy the car or it gets traded in, they spend money in getting the car repaired. So maybe the car needs new tires, maybe it needs some work done under the hood, maybe it needs something done to the paint, all this stuff. You guys know what I'm talking about. They typically will spend more money in the reconditioning aspect of the vehicle, because again, they need to make sure that they have good reviews, their customers are happy and all that. And so that's the first part. And so a lot of the times at these lots, the cost of the cars will typically be higher than a used car lot, and that is the reason, because they spend more money into the cars from a reconditioning standpoint. On the flip side, with the used car lots, they do the exact opposite. A lot of times they don't spend as much money in the reconditioning process, and a lot of the times they just kind of count on people coming in that are really desperate to buy a vehicle. Typically they won't have the best financial situation, especially from a credit standpoint, and so then these people just want to get into any car possible. And so these dealerships, really what they do is what I call spit shine and front line. That's what I always called it when I was a car salesman. And really what that means is the dealerships will buy cars and they won't even look at them. They'll basically just clean them off. Sometimes they don't even clean them off, to be frank, and they just throw them on the front line for sale. And again, it's just a completely different demographic of car sales. Typically the pricing will be lower on these cars, but again, you could have cars with just tons of issues because they don't really check them out. A lot of times they'll just make sure they pass emissions, that's it. They don't care about anything else other than passing emissions, and then if the state has a state inspection as well, then passing that. And if a state doesn't have state inspection or emissions, then they don't care about either. And again, spit shine and front line. So finally, again, lower cost, but you might run into some problems. Now, I know a lot of you are probably looking for hard numbers, and right now in the automotive industry, the average profit made off of a used car is around $2,000 roughly. And the thing about this number is it's just kind of out there. If you buy cars that are in the lower end in terms of price range, then there's probably not going to be as much markup. But if you buy a car that's in the higher end in terms of price range, there's probably going to be more markup with a used car. And I think a really good example is when I worked at a dealership, a lot of these less expensive cars, especially if they were purchased at auction, they pretty much had no markup in them, or maybe they only had like a couple $100 of markup in them. But then if we got like a really expensive highline car, like maybe a really expensive Mercedes or Porsche or something like that, then they would have like literally $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 of markup in them. And so it really just depends on the type of car that you're purchasing. So for this part where we're making generalizations, the general rule of thumb is the less expensive the car is, the less markup there is in the car, versus the more expensive the car is, typically there's going to be more markup in the car. And then there's that other rule of thumb where typically if you're buying from a bigger dealership that puts more money into reconditioning, there's usually not going to be as much markup in the car because they're spending more money in the car, but they still have to keep the car within market value range. Whereas if you buy a car from a used car lot, they're typically not going to put as much money into the car. So there's going to be more markup in the car, but obviously there's probably going to be issues with the car as well. So it's kind of like pick your poison. Do you want to pay a little bit more money to get a quality product, or do you want to pay less money potentially and have issues also potentially, right? So that's everything on the used car side of things. Now with the new car side of things, if both new cars are exactly the same, then both of the new car dealerships have purchased them for the same amount of money, so they should be able to sell them for the same amount of money. Now in this section, I'm going to give the hard numbers first, and then I'm going to get into explaining everything behind the numbers. So in terms of new cars, right now the industry average is when a manufacturer produces a new car, there's typically a profit margin of 7 to 10%. So they're making about 7 to 10% profit when they sell it to the dealerships. And then once the dealerships take acquisition of the car, there's typically a 7 to 10% markup. And of course the light pops off randomly, but there's usually about a 7 to 10% markup from what the dealership paid to it to the total manufacturer's suggested retail pricing. So you can imagine, since this is percentage based, the more expensive the vehicle is that you're purchasing, chances are it's going to have more markup, but again, it's just all a percentage. I think this is better put if you put cars into different types of categories. So the first category is what you think of when you hear the word car. So you think of like a sedan, right? Those types of vehicles typically have the least amount of markup in them, and they're going to be in the lower percentage range just because they're a lot more expensive to build versus what they can be sold for, right? Nobody's going to pay a ton of money, and again, there's exceptions, but nobody's going to pay a ton of money for a sedan, right? And so those vehicles, again, the manufacturing cost is typically more on them, but then the retail cost is lower, so there's usually less profit, and also they're typically in lower price ranges, and so there's usually not a whole lot of markup in cars like that. Now moving into the next category, you've got SUVs, and most SUVs are not body on frame anymore. They're produced in a similar fashion to most sedans, and because of that they don't have as much markup as they used to. But that being said, they typically have a little bit more markup than a sedan type car does, and this is just because similar manufacturing costs. However, they can be sold for a little bit more money, so there can be a little bit more profit in SUVs, especially like the bigger type SUVs than those ones. And again, some of them still are body on frame, so they're a little bit easier to produce and all that, and so some of them will be a little bit more in terms of the markup. And then the final one is trucks. And if you guys are wondering why everyone seems to be building trucks, it's because they typically have the highest profit margin because they're really inexpensive to build with, again, most trucks body on frame construction. And because of the construction with it and because of how everything's simple, and you guys see with trucks a lot of the times, they can have it so they have like the whole same setup, like the powertrain, engine, transmission, like everything is the same. But then the interiors are different and the price ranges on trucks can just be astronomically different. And so trucks typically have the biggest profit margin in them. And so again, if we go back to that 7 to 10%, a lot of the time the cars will be less than that range, and sometimes the trucks will be a little bit higher than that range. And so what you really need to do is research into the specific type of vehicle that you are purchasing, whether it's a car, an SUV, or a truck, and you need to see what the actual costs are associated with building that vehicle so you can see what the true markup is in that vehicle. But again, for our generalizations for today's video, if you're buying a car, it's probably gonna have the least amount of markup in it, whereas if you're buying a truck, then it's most likely going to have the most amount of markup in it. Finishing things off with the new car section before we get into the exceptions with some of the rules here. The last thing I want to talk about that you always hear people talk about is MSRP, which is manufacturer suggested retail pricing, and then you hear invoice, and then sometimes you'll hear the term holdback. Really what these all mean is the manufacturer's suggested retail price is what the manufacturer says the car should be sold for, and that is typically where the dealership would be able to make the most profit unless they sell it for over MSRP, but we'll get into that a little bit later with the exceptions. And then the invoice of the vehicle is not the dealership's true cost on a car. You'll hear dealerships always say that, oh yeah, invoice is our cost on the car. For some manufacturers that might be true, but for most manufacturers that is not the true cost. That's kind of like the crazy discounted price, but again, not the true cost. Typically what the true cost is you've got the manufacturer's suggested retail pricing, you've got the invoice, and then you have what a lot of manufacturers will call holdback, and it'll be a little bit of extra money they give to the dealerships, kind of like a little bit of profit padding. Dealerships use that money for different reasons, but that is typically what the true cost of the car is. Now there's other sorts of things that can make it so that dealerships have a little bit lower cost. Like if a dealership sells a ton of a certain type of vehicle, they might get extra money from the manufacturer, and so then that technically brings down the true cost in the vehicles a little bit more, but that's a little bit too complex. And so really all you need to know is reference back to the earlier part of the video where if you buy a car, there's probably not a lot of markup, and if you buy a truck, there's probably a little bit more markup. And so again, just research the specific vehicle that you are looking to purchase. Now let's get into the exceptions to these rules, and some of these rules will actually apply to used as well as new, but we're going to kind of focus on the new for a moment. And the biggest exception is specialty type vehicles and new vehicles right now. And with manufacturing being kind of slow, it's starting to pick up. There's also certain things with the profit in vehicles. So right now with manufacturing being slowed down, the supply and demand in the market is absolutely insane. And so the market value in pretty much any car is just shot through the roof because everyone wants to buy a car right now, but there's not enough new cars to buy. And so that's something that we're dealing with right now. But aside from that, the general rule that I've noticed is new cars, and what I mean by new cars is when a manufacturer releases a new model or when they release a complete redesign on a car, right when it comes out, typically the market value is just through the roof, and usually they'll charge over what the manufacturer suggests them to sell it at. So a really good example recently with what we've discussed on the channel is with the Ram TRX. A lot of dealerships for the orders on that truck were asking for an astronomical amounts over sticker price, like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 over sticker price for these trucks. And then think earlier in the year with the C8 Corvette, like the one that I ordered, for example, stickers for about $85,000, but most dealerships for an $85,000 C8 Corvette are selling them for $110,000 to $115,000 to $120,000. So they're all selling them over sticker. So this is the cars that are going to be, or I should say these are the cars that are going to be kind of like the exception to the rule. Again, are like the specialty type vehicles and the new vehicles. And when I say specialty type vehicles, is think whenever Porsche releases any sort of GT car, even if it's been out for a while, they always seem to go over sticker. Ford with the Raptors, depending on where you live, a lot of times they'll be over sticker. Like here in Utah, they're pretty much always over sticker. California, I hear the same thing. But it just depends on the type of vehicle. And so those will be the exceptions where the margin is going to be a lot larger, but that's not for the manufacturer. That profit's being picked up by the dealership. So just be aware of that. And if you guys are wondering what my advice is on stuff like this, is research the market and look at the resale value. So a really good example is, let's go back to the C8 Corvette. So let's say that you go to a dealership and the dealership is like, hey, we'll sell you a C8 Corvette for $10,000 over sticker. Most people are like, that's a ripoff, that's whatever, this and that. But let's look at the used car market on C8 Corvettes. Right now, a fully loaded C8 Corvette used is still going for over $100,000. So if you bought, let's say my order, which was $85,000, and you paid 10 grand over sticker, $95,000, and then you could go and sell it for $100,000, $105,000, maybe $110,000, then are you really getting a bad deal? So when you're looking at these specialty type vehicles that typically have a little bit different with the profit margins, you need to look at the new car market and the used car market as well. And so even if you're paying over sticker, and even if it's making the dealership a bunch of money as a new car or a used car, just look at what they're selling for. And if you're able to break even on the car or make a little bit of money on the car, then I don't see how that's really a bad deal. It just requires a little bit more footwork on your part. Now, my final thoughts in terms of the profits on cars and everything is the fact that you need to kind of drill into your head that a manufacturer or a dealership making a large amount of profit on a car is not an indication of you getting a good deal. You getting a good deal is a car fitting within your budget and you not losing a ton of money in ownership of that vehicle. So again, a really good example, and we're gonna do two different examples here, is if you buy a car and pay over MSRP for the car, but then you go and sell it for even more money and you make money off of it, you're getting a great deal because you just bought a car and you made money on it. Maybe you drove it, all that kind of stuff, and you made money. A really good example was me with this Camaro that I had before the Supra. I made about $1,000 on that car, so I got to drive a Camaro ZL1 1LE for about 4 months, and I put 1,700 miles on the car, and I made about $1,000. That's a great deal. Whereas on the flip side, a lot of people go, oh, you have to get a huge discount on a car to get a good deal. But let's say you go buy a new SUV and they give you $10,000 discount on the SUV, which, I mean, that's probably a little bit too high. Let's say $5,000. You get a $5,000 discount on the SUV, and then you have it for a while and you put some miles on it. And then when you go to trade it in or sell it, it's worth $10,000 less than what you paid for it. Then, right, you're getting a worse deal than the person that paid over sticker. Maybe you're spending less money, but you're not getting a return on your money. And so I think that's a better indication of what a good deal is not how much profit, again, the dealership or the manufacturer's making, but how much money you are making or losing. If you're losing a ton of money on a car, in my opinion, that's a horrible deal. Whereas if you are able to break even on a car or make money on a car, that is truly a good deal. And so even though this video is all about how much dealerships actually pay for cars, if you stayed till the end, then that is the ultimate lesson, and that's the thing that I would go in with, is do your research, look at the cars that you're buying, look at the resale value on them, and my recommendation is try to stay within cars that have good resale value that you can buy at a good enough price where you're not going to lose a lot of money. A car is a depreciating asset ultimately for most cars, and so chances are you will lose some money, but you just want to minimize how much money you're going to lose. That is going to sum things up for today's video, and sorry about the whining dog in the background. He's just goes crazy sometimes, and he's a husky mix, so he makes like all the weird sounds, and yeah. Anyways, if you're stopping in for the first time, please subscribe, comment down below what you think, and then I will see all of you in that next video.